So it's rolling? Okay, good. Yeah. Hey, well, welcome. So this is COM-402, at least I hope. So do we have, is it a big enough room? Just barely? Yes, so yeah, thank you. And there's, I'm not that scary. There's more places down here if needed. So, okay, so this is COM-402, Information Security and Privacy, and in this first lecture, I'll cover basically two main things. First, just the basics and logistics of the course. Come on in, there's more seats down here. And some pointers into just how the course is going to work, and then I will do an overview of the content, so you'll get some feel for what you're getting into, hopefully. Okay. So you should be able to easily find all of this information online. But here are some of the important links. The most important one is the Moodle site. Should be up and available. Be aware that let's see, Christina, we put the future week's lectures back, right? So you will. Okay. So we are going to have very soon. You'll be able to see all the week's worth of lecture slides from last year. But please be aware that they will change somewhat. You know, they're totally tentative. They will give you some idea, but don't depend on a particular lecture being exactly the same. You know, kind of in advance. So. So you'll find the lecture slides and, as we go along in the course, critical materials for the exercises and homeworks and things, everything on Moodle. Most important thing to pay attention to. We'll sometimes use Speak Up and Clicker as well for in the lectures. So here's a again, tentative. There might be minor changes. Tentative topic syllabus for the 14 weeks of the course. So this course is a fairly broad overview of information security. It doesn't go super deep into any given area, but it tries to give you a taste for a fairly broad set of topics that we'll be covering. And I'll give you, later in this lecture, I'll give you a taste for those topics in a little bit more detail. The main instructors are me and Linus Gasser. And we have several fantastic assistants, 3 of whom are here at the moment. And you can find all of our email addresses and contact information on the lecture slides or on Moodle. The general course, the general shape of the course are our lectures, which are basically about basic concepts, covering different concepts. We're doing the experiment of trying to record the lectures, and we'll see if we can, find a right way of posting videos for those who can't make a lecture in person and want to catch up. There's absolutely no guarantee of the quality of video. This is totally amateur hour when it comes to videos, right? So this is totally informal, and I can't even promise necessarily that it will always work or that we'll be able to continue it. Like I said, it's an experiment, but it was something we were asked for often last year, and so I definitely thought it was worth trying. Not that, of course, I really do want to see all your shining faces when you can make it, but I understand when you can't. So the lectures are, again, on Tuesdays now. On Fridays, most weeks, except for the week before spring break, there are There are exercise sessions Fridays at 3:15 p.m. and that's mainly the time when you have the opportunity to ask the TAs, the teaching assistants, detailed questions. So the teaching assistants will go over the exercises, what you need to do, how you need to install and use software you'll need to do to use the exercises, and that'll be an opportunity for you to get detailed Q&A and also to coordinate with each other and in terms of learning and discussing course topics and things like that. You are expected, of course, to do your own work, but interaction and sharing notes on general techniques and stuff is very much encouraged, as long as you're doing your own work. So the grading will be based on both homework exercises and a final exam. So a lot of it, 60% of the grade will be on the final. So take that very seriously. But the other 40% will be on the homework exercises, and furthermore, there are 6 homeworks planned, and we'll drop the lowest scoring homework. So, for example, if you're sick or one of the homeworks is just at the really bad time, with all of the other midterms or something like that, I still encourage you strongly to try to do all the homeworks. But if you really bomb on one of them, then that's okay. Okay, but again, take the final exam seriously. So what will the programming exercises be? So you'll be at now another important point. Keep in mind that the exercise sessions on Friday are mainly for you to figure out what you need to do, get your questions answered, play with the tools and stuff like that. You cannot expect to complete the assignments during the Friday exercise session. That's additional time on your own, and how much that takes will depend on a lot. For some of you who have, especially those who have considerable low-level experience, with programming, with code and networks and the various topics this course touches on, you might find the exercises pretty easy. For others, you might have more catching up to do on some of the kind of background on networking and stuff. The exercises might take you a little bit longer. That's okay either way, but just and most importantly, some of the exercises involve debugging code or digging through packets and doing things that if you happen on the right approach or get it right the first time, it can be very easy and quick. But if not, it's possible to get stuck and take a lot of time. So just fair warning: the amount of time the exercises will take is likely to vary a lot. So in other words, get started early. Don't try to do them at the very last minute. Okay. So the exercises, will again use the group sessions to introduce the tools and what you're supposed to do. Everything, all the exercises will use Docker containers. So you'll need to be able to run Docker. We have virtual machine. You can install it on a virtual machine. If you have a Windows machine, the TAs on Friday will give you all the instructions on how to do this. Quite a few, although not all of the programming exercises, will involve capture the flag type activities, where you have to write some code to perform an attack and find a magic token and report it to us. And if you find the token, you get full credit on that particular problem of that particular exercise. If you don't find the token, you get 0 credit on that problem. So these are just problems within an exercise. We're not talking about complete exercises, all or nothing, but particular problems in exercises in many cases, kind of all or nothing, right? So just be aware of that. So the programming exercises will generally alternate between attack perspective and defense perspective, right? So in the odd-numbered homeworks, you will pretend to be an attacker, attacking network, attacking a database of sensitive information, de-anonymizing supposedly anonymized data, things like that. And in the even-numbered homeworks, those will be more defense-focused. Well, kind of, now you know the attacks. What can we do to protect against the attacks? And so you'll have to do things like better hardening a password database and using TLS to secure, to encrypt communication and things like that. Okay. So homework 1 and 2 really focuses on data access security and in a network context. What can attackers do by listening to monitoring a network, and how can you protect against that? Homework 3 and 4 will focus a little bit more on databases and especially databases of particularly sensitive things like passwords and stuff like that. And we won't have you using the $5 wrench attack because it's just not as much fun. But we'll have you trying plenty of other attacks. Finally, the homework 5 and 6 will focus more on data itself, data privacy, anonymizing and de-anonymizing data. All right. Okay. So that's the general shape of the course. Let's dive in a little bit more and look at the concepts we'll talk about. Oh, and by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I know it's a big big class and it might be a little intimidating, but I'm happy to answer questions and have discussions. So this is an information security course. We're studying information security, but why do we want information security? Well, we want it because some types of information are sensitive, right? And we often care more about protecting more sensitive information. And certainly some information is more sensitive than others, right? How many of you are hodlers? Have some Bitcoin, Ethereum? Yeah, okay, good. So I bet the keys to your Bitcoin, Ethereum, your hodler wallet are much more sensitive, you consider much more sensitive than certain other types of information, right? Of course, partly because they're small, partly because you can lose a lot very quickly, depending on how much is in there, of course. Now, in many cases, how sensitive information is depends on not just the information itself, but more subtle things depending on context. One of the examples being, in most environments, taking pictures in public is not considered violating anybody's privacy or impinging on sensitive information. But if you've got a really big telephoto lens that kind of reaches right over to that window, then at least the law might think differently depending on what that imagery is used for. So sensitivity can depend on context, and again, the way information is used. And who sees them. You might be perfectly comfortable with your friends seeing some photos that you don't want your employer or your future employer to see, right? So sensitivity can also depend on how long the information lasts, and this is often very important. Time is often a very important factor in reasoning about how sensitive information is. So some types of information is very ephemeral, like like the cell tower logs of who cell phone and internet companies keep as to who's connected where at what point. That's very short-term information. Each of those data points is probably not that sensitive by itself, but often in aggregate, when many of those small data points are used together, they can actually produce much more sensitive, a much more sensitive collection of information that can, for example, reveal your habits, where you go, how often, who you visit, things like that. Of course, some information is actively provided and volunteered by users in some cases, sometimes with good understanding of how sensitive they are, and sometimes with not so good understanding. Of course, there's the the well-known principle of informed consent. If you're giving your information voluntarily, that shouldn't be a problem, except when it is. And there are many examples of that where privacy is actually an ecosystem problem and not just an individual problem. For example, if we're talking about genetic databases, if you decide to upload, get your genome sequenced, which you can do these days, and put it all online in the name of science, that's great for science. Researchers like me love that. But you're not only volunteering your own data, but your a whole extended family's data, because information of what diseases you might be susceptible to, and many of your relatives, descendants, ancestors, and so on, can be inferred from that. So again, the kind of scope and longevity and effect of information often determines how sensitive it is. Another factor is how slowly or how difficult it is to change, right? So things like social security number or passport number are kind of a pain to change, quite a pain to change actually. But even worse in some respects are biometric information, like your fingerprint. It's, you gotta, if you want to change your fingerprint, you gotta be, have access to some kind of Men in Black type, or what was the recent one? Anyway, so serious, spy gear that's probably painful as well if it's anything like they say in the movies, right? So, so anyway, that's kind of the sensitivity of information. And that leads us to the topic of the next lecture, which will focus on common threats. What often goes wrong? What classes of security and privacy threats do we need to be aware of in general, and do we need to think about? And there's a wide class, many broad classes. We can't really provide an exhaustive picture necessarily in this course, but we'll touch on a number of general categories. So, for example, data breaches, when hackers get sensitive data, especially in large amounts, affecting many people. We'll cover de-anonymization, where supposedly anonymized data sets turn out to be sensitive after all, based on what you or what a hacker can do with them. Things like ransomware, the malware that encrypts your hard drive and says, hey, I want your Bitcoin if you want your data back, right? And then a broad class of attacks we often call social engineering attacks, or that are partly social engineering, like emails that try to trick you into believing the sender is someone you know, and you should disclose your password, or do something for them that lets them basically steal someone's identity or impersonate them, right? So You know, so just as a kind of quick overview of some of the threats, the types of threats we'll be looking at. You know, there's many super interesting ones. A couple years ago, the U.S. government had this this database of basically the most sensitive, detailed, exhaustive personal information imaginable on everybody in the U.S. with a security clearance, which is a lot. And to get a security clearance, you had to file, I assume you still have to file a form that's like 120 pages long with, you know, all of your history, every political organization or every organization you've ever been affiliated with, just in case you're a communist or something like that. You know, everything you've done, every friend you've ever had, you know, because like this is a serious background check information, right? So, you know, basically all of the skeletons in your closet, you know, are, you know, you had better disclose if you don't want to get in, you know, really big trouble later. And so, you know, they had this information on like, you know, 21 million people with, that had gotten security clearances over a number of years. And then, you know, they've kind of neglected to sufficiently protect that giant cache of information, right? And so some nice hackers came in through another company, a contracting company that had access to this company's network, and kind of snuck in the side door and ran away with the whole database. And, you know, of course, this is like the perfect piece of information if you either want to impersonate any of these, you know, people that that themselves are precisely those that tend to have access to highly sensitive information, or this information is also perfect if you want to blackmail, you know, or coerce any one of these people, because, you know, they specifically declare, you know, the embarrassing things you did as a teenager or as a kid. Well, that's on there, and if you don't want it to go out, then, you know, you better do what the hacker tells you, right? So this is, you know, just one, but this is just one of a huge number of examples of, you know, huge data breaches that have been appearing more and more. And they keep coming. So Switzerland had its own similar, you know, I mean, different in many of the details, but pretty serious data breach related to RUAG, one of the big defense organizations. We've also been seeing more and more breaches and attacks specifically on targets like hospitals. Now, why would hackers target hospitals? You know, hospitals aren't hurting anyone. Why, you know, who would do such a thing? Well, you know, they're soft targets in that, you know, usually hospitals are filled with people who know about, you know, treating people, not about keeping computers secure. So they're soft, you know, often not the very state of the art in security in their IT systems. They're full of medical devices that have computers in them that run Windows 95 that hasn't been supported by Microsoft for years, and therefore have no patches to all the now very well-known hacks and malware techniques. And the hackers know that, you know, if you take down a hospital's network, you know, threaten them with a denial of service attack, as we call it, and say, well, you can get your hospital back, you know, and continue saving people's lives once you pay us this amount of Bitcoin, then, you know, hospitals are kind of going to pay that, right? And they often do. So this type of ransomware has been somewhat effective, from what I hear. So there's a lot of different types of threats and different approaches. They also, you know, come from very different types of attackers. So with very different motivations. So, you know, in some cases, any random person, a friend, a partner, a journalist, you know, any individual can be an attacker in some form. Yeah, in security privacy, we tend to use the word attacker very broadly and generally. And it doesn't mean specifically somebody with a wrench that's trying to hit you over the head, but somebody that's trying to violate any security or privacy property that we might care about, including, say, a partner that's just a little jealous, or and wants to spy on see if their partner is cheating on them by installing spouseware onto their mobile device or PC or something. Of course, there's a very large class of just outright thieves and that are just trying to make money, and a lot of attackers don't care probably about your data unless it helps them make money, right? And they've figured out a lot of ways to use people's data to make opportunistically to make money, but often that's the ultimate goal. And we'll talk about a number of those types of attacks. And then, kind of at the top of the ladder, there are the well-funded state agencies, and especially involving certain countries that tend to be in the news a lot lately on both sides of the Atlantic, that have very powerful both attack and defensive capabilities. In fact, it seems like their attack capabilities seem to be getting the lead often on anybody's defense capabilities. So yeah, so we'll talk about some of those threats. Just as an example, one of the most basic attacks I already mentioned, phishing, where an attacker tries to trick you into divulging sensitive information. This, among many attacks, this particular one is an example of a very common approach, which is to try to engineer an image or a web page or something in a form that looks like Google or an online service that you have an account on, and tricks you into entering your username and password on there. And of course, the attacker gets it instead of the website you're thinking gets it. And so that's very common, partly because it's a very general and powerful form of attack, and it's also quite hard to defend against, because if you get an image or a form, that can be anything, and it's actually pretty hard to prevent an image from looking like some other legitimate website, right? So after we talk about common threats, we'll get into some of the defenses. Now, this is not going to be a cryptography course, but we have to understand some of the basics of cryptography to understand some of the later parts of the course. And so we'll talk about review basic cryptography concepts, symmetric and asymmetric encryption, cryptographic hash functions, authenticated encryption, key exchange protocols, and some of the security properties they provide, like confidentiality, integrity, and authentication. So we'll treat these as black boxes. We're not going to get into the math at all. If you want to get deep into how these things actually work, you take Serge Vaudinet's cryptography course. I highly recommend it. It's very, very cool, fun stuff. But here we'll just cover the basic concepts that you need to understand the place of crypto in helping to solve some of our security privacy challenges. So basically, there's of course encryption, which broadly just makes data look unintelligible, hopefully, to an attacker who doesn't have the key to it. And all modern encryption relies in some respect on keys. You never, so the very early naive encryption algorithms relied on keeping the algorithm secret, right? So that, if you don't understand, my particular way of, twiddling the letters in the alphabet around, hopefully you won't figure out what my messages is. But modern cryptography has totally changed that. Modern cryptography assumes that the algorithms are public. The attacker does have the algorithm. It's just the attacker shouldn't have the keys, right? And if the attacker doesn't have the keys and the encryption algorithm is strong, then the attacker hopefully won't be able to get the message. But that depends on all kinds of assumptions and kind of systemic issues that where things can go wrong. And of course, there's many different ways to use encryption and different types of data that can be encrypted at different times. For example, if we consider just data sitting on a hard drive somewhere or on a USB stick or something, and, you encrypt it when it goes onto the disk, when your application writes it to a file, and you decrypt it when it comes back. We generally call that encryption at rest, encryption of data at rest. And so, this is good for some things. It protects, used properly, it can protect the data if, your device is stolen or the USB stick is stolen, right? So that's very important. But you always have to ask the question, who holds the encryption keys? How are they managed? If your encryption keys are actually stored on the same device right next to the encrypted data, that's not, and the attacker happens to notice that, that, oh, yeah, there's your Bitcoin wallet and there's the encryption key for your Bitcoin wallet right next to it, that's going to be a very happy hacker. So where do you keep the keys? That's always kind of the second order question we always have to ask when we think about using encryption. And what if a key is lost or misplaced or stolen, right? This is another very critical question when it comes to cryptocurrency wallets, right? It's just as bad for you if you lose your wallet. If you lose the last key to your wallet and just can't use your Bitcoin for anything, as if somebody else had stolen it, right? Kind of if you just lose it and nobody can use it, well, you've lost just as much as if somebody had stolen it and you lost it that way, right? So, and of course, encryption at rest doesn't protect the data if it's moving, right, by definition. And so that's why we have, other uses of encryption, such as encryption in transit. So this is what TLS or SSL does. It encrypts data while it's going over the network from one machine to another. For example, from a website to your laptop or phone. And so, when that's done right, it can protect against attacks in the network, at least certain classes of attacks. But then you always have to ask, who are the endpoints in this? What does in transit from who to who, right? And sometimes that means just from you to a cloud server, right? So if you're talking to Google Docs or Gmail, then your email is encrypted between you and Gmail, but Google servers have have the other end of the same encryption keys to that, and so they can see the contents of your email. You're trusting Google with the content of your email. You're just not trusting someone between you and Google, right? Whereas other approaches like end-to-end encrypted messengers, Skype used to be in this class long ago in the heady peer-to-peer networking days before Skype was bought by Microsoft and turned into an evil monster. Not to throw too many subjective judgments into here, but of course, some newer apps arose to take their place, like WhatsApp and Signal, that still try to keep messages encrypted end to end, so meaning from one user all the way to the other user, so that the cloud servers in the middle that are responsible for storing and queuing the messages can't actually decrypt and see what's in the messages, right? And so these are different ways of implementing encryption in transit, and we'll get into those more later in the course. right? But you know, none of these uses of encryption tend to be perfect. You know, we saw a few years ago in the Snowden leaks some of the really fun ways that certain agencies managed to get into get into encrypted communications. In this case, Google was encrypting all of their communications between different data centers around the world, you know, which is great. You know, great for their own security, great for their users' privacy, except they had these front ends, these gateways at the edge of each cloud, and somehow this spy agency, you know, managed to get into those gateways and get the keys there, and so they were able to watch everything that that was being sent between these different Google data centers, even though it was supposed to be encrypted, right? And so there are often many ways to attack, you know, even when the cryptographic algorithms are good, there's often many ways to attack the endpoints or the ways the keys are managed. So another big problem in general with encryption is what we call usability. How usable is the encryption, right? And this is something that, for example, web browsers have been struggling with for ages. Like, you know, what does it mean when you see a lock icon appear, you know, in your web browser? What exactly does it mean? What does it mean when you don't see the lock icon? What does it mean when it's green versus gray versus red? You know, these are, you know, and what should the user do if it's not what they expect? Well, you know, very commonly they'll just do nothing because they won't even notice. But you know, web browsers vendors have gradually been trying to improve the way they communicate security and make encryption more usable, but it's still a big challenge. For example, if you you know, visit a website that has a bad and expired certificate or something like that, maybe the website is fine, but you know, users tend to get a dialog box that looks something like that. And you know, this is a perceptual translation of what a dialog box often looks like by a usability expert that was studying usability problems in websites. And often, you know, it's totally not clear. You know, well, okay, I went to this, something went wrong. What do I do? How do I even think about that? What to do? And so, you know, that's a big problem for encryption and security in general. Okay, so moving on. What about, this is security of databases, especially databases of sensitive information of different kinds, right? And of course, there's many different types of critical databases. How many of you are taking the data science masters out of curiosity? Okay, quite a number of you. Good. Well, welcome. Yeah. So this is, you know, thinking about how to deal with and secure data sets, you know, that are you know, might or might not contain sensitive information is becoming a more and more critical problem and skill for you know, people whose job might be to handle data, and that's more and more people these days. And so we'll look at different type of databases, different attacks against, you know, say database query languages like SQL, the common structured query language that a lot of database uses, and you know, some of these attacks are used by attackers to get sensitive data, and we'll look at ways to protect those data sets and the databases. Right? So, of course, one very important topic in general in thinking about the sensitivity of information is what is personally identifiable information. So this is a very fundamental, important topic, especially when it comes to the you know, legal approaches to privacy and data management, especially. So how many of you have heard of the GDPR? Yeah. GDPR? No, no. Uh-oh. You are in the middle of this continent called Europe, right? I know that Switzerland is not in the EU, but it's, EU is all around, and in this, big blob around us called the EU, they have this big new law coming into effect in May, as I recall. Oh, you've heard of the GDPR. Awesome. What is the GDPR? Yes. Yep. Excellent. So, so the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's exactly as you say, a law that tries to harmonize. All of the EU countries already had data protection laws of different kinds, but they were, kind of way out of sync with each other. GDPR tries to harmonize them and provide a kind of comprehensive standard for rights for users, for how companies and other organizations should handle and protect users' data, right? So starting in May, companies all over Europe and any company that wants to do business with Europe, which is pretty much any company anywhere, is having to think about the GDPR and what its provisions mean, and a lot of that is basically provisions on how personally identifiable information is handled. So information about people, and this includes issues like the right to be forgotten. If a company is holding data about you, then the GDPR now is going to say, well, you have the right to figure out what data they are holding on you, and you are allowed to require them to delete it. It's your choice, right? And so a lot of companies are scrambling to figure out, well, how do you implement this, and what does it mean? What type of data is personally identifiable? And one of the reasons this isn't entirely clear cut is that there's a lot of data that is not your name and address and phone number and and passport number and stuff like that, but data like the movies you've watched on some streaming service or other things that is not immediately identifying, but if you have the right set of that data and an attacker can correlate it with other data, then it becomes, in effect, personally identifying, because they can derive your name and address or track you down in some other way in a more circuitous route, right? So the topic of personally identifiable information and what makes information PII is very important, and we'll explore that. In systems, computing systems that manage data, we'll need to look at well, how do you control access to data? So, and this access control typically happens at a number of levels. There's like network level, who can talk to who on a network, who can get in through the firewall, how, and things like that. There's management of user databases, and then the operating system level, like on a particular laptop or desktop machine, there can be multiple accounts, and those have a different authentication and user systems. And then even particular applications like databases, a typical SQL database has its own set of users and access control mechanisms that's independent and orthogonal to the operating systems and the networks access management systems. And so it's important to understand, to some degree, how some of these access control mechanisms work and what can go wrong, what types of things can go wrong with them. And so we'll look at access control mechanisms and authentication mechanisms. So access control says, what a given user should have access to, what data you should and shouldn't be able to get to, whereas authentication is the mechanism a system uses to ensure that you are the user that you claim to be, right? So entering your password, or using a fingerprint reader, or something like that, right? So so access control answers questions like, who should be able to access to data, what data they should be able to access, how should they be able to access it, read, write, other types of access, should they be able to revoke access, add other users, administer, and when they should be able to access. So sometimes you can open a vault during business hours, but it stays closed otherwise, right? And there's many different forms of authentication that we'll explore. So, starting with simple username and password, and then various two-factor and multi-factor authentication mechanisms, which use a combination of something you know, like a password, and something you have, like a token, smart card, or a phone, right? So you can learn all about two-factor authentication by looking back at that slide if you want to later, but I'll leave it at that. Yeah, and so like I mentioned, access control and authentication has to happen both network-wide and on a given system, and there are many attacks against authentication systems, especially network-based authentication attacks that rely on, such as phishing attacks that try to get users to disclose their credentials. And so we'll look at a number of those. So so that's probably a good time to take a short break. Let's take a break for 10 minutes and come back at 5:10 to continue.